Chapter 46. The Aborigines, Section 5, However Just. These representations of individual conduct, and with whatever severity the measures of government bore upon the Aborigines, that unhappy people afforded ample reason for apprehension and even abhorrence. Their crimes were fearful, and the effect of their outrage on the colonial mind can only be imagined. The fierce robbers of European origin who had infested the land were not half so terrible. These were at least restrained by early associations and national sympathies, often by conscience and even by each other. But the natives now united the antipathy of a national foe and the rapacity of a banditti with the spite of individual revenge. They were at once a people in arms and a distributed band of assassins. The correspondence between the local and imperial authorities exhibits the feelings of the governor, and his full consciousness that however necessary his proceedings might seem on the spot, surveyed from the distance, they would wear the aspect of cruelty. In 1828, he apprised Lord Goderich that the proposal to remove the natives from the island had not met his concurrence, and that the commissioners for lands had pointed out the northeast coast as adapted to their wants, well sheltered and warm, abounding with game, accessible by water and easy to guard. It was stated by Colonel Arthur that harsh measures were demanded by the colonists, but that he could not dismiss from his recollection that the whites were the aggressors and that every plan should be tried before treating the natives as accredited enemies. 3 months after, he forwarded another communication, which referred to the murders recently committed and justified the proclamation which he had issued for their expulsion. So exasperated were the settlers that the safety of the blacks themselves seemed to demand this precaution. He had, however, found it impossible to assign one district owing to the animosities of the tribes against each other, and therefore he resolved to expel them to the remoter portions of their several territories. In 2 other communications of the same year, the governor reported the temporary retirement of the natives in search of marine subsistence and their return from their winter quarters in the November following, when their animosity had not abated. A dark catalogue of murders, including every age, condition, and sex, attested their subtlety and sanguinary spirit. He still declared that no means were neglected to conciliate and reclaim them, consistent with the interests of the colony at large. But their indiscriminate attacks were equally directed against their benefactors and their enemies. Communication had become difficult, a risk of life, and almost impossible. These statements are, unhappily, sustained by ample proof. It would be a waste of time even to condense, in the most succinct relation, all the incidents that occurred. Narrative is tedious by the monotony of detail, and the events themselves were recorded by those who witnessed them with ominous brevity. Such crimes were of daily occurrence, perhaps sometimes multiplied by rumor, but often unheard of and unrecorded. The perils of the stockmen were constant. Many of them were repeatedly wounded, and one, named Cubit, was 9 times speared, and yet survived. Death assumed new forms daily. The poet of the Iliad did not describe more numerous varieties in the slaughter of his heroes. The shepherd went from home in the morning, attended by his dog and armed with a gun, now unavailing for his defense. He never returned. Had he escaped to the bush? Such a step was improbable. His employers are soon informed that the blacks have been near, that the sheep have been wounded or beaten to death. The search now becomes diligent. At length, the melancholy reality is clear. They find a mutilated form which still preserves sufficient proof that the lost shepherd lies there. The sad catastrophe excites the compassion of the master, but it provokes the fellow servants to rage, and they devote themselves to the destruction of the murderous race. The little child strays outside the cottage of her parent, fresh as the morning and warmed with the hilarity of young life. A shriek is heard to succeed quickly the loud laugh of pleasure. The mother rushes forward, sees a black boy fleeing in the distance, and then beholds the victim of his malice. She draws forth the spear, and her child is dead. The settler, now grown rich by his flocks and tillage, looks forward to the enjoyment of his opulence in domestic happiness. The companion of his early labors and privations forms the chief object in the picture. But while he was dreaming of future bliss, the envious eye of a savage, which had recognized in that prosperous homestead a station of his father's, had glanced over and blighted all. Those who were compelled to travel from home left their families the prey to inexpressible anxiety. Every moment of delay awakened new forebodings. Often would the settler see his wife and children on some prominent spot, the subjects of fears which required no interpreter, shading the eyes in the attitude of earnest attention. And when they caught the first glimpse of his approach, the rushing together and marks of gratulation indicated the gladness of watchers, whose painful task is done. To appear in safety was a new though daily deliverance. But if such were the fears at home, the traveller himself was not free from perturbation. He would neglect the common dangers of a rocky descent and sidling way to guard against perils far more dreaded. He would often pause to listen. The moving of the leaf would terrify him. He would hear a rush. It was but the cattle. He would gaze steadfastly at some black substance far off, until convinced that it was the stalk of a tree. Then, reproaching his fears, he would gallop on rapidly. Then, moving round some overhanging rock, he would see savage faces and poised spears. Retreat is now impossible. He spurs his horse, which seems almost to be conscious of danger, and perhaps reaches his home exhausted with fatigue and dread. Happy, however, to have been once more preserved. Nor is it possible to describe the emotions which were wrought up by the consciousness that a feeble woman and helpless children were exposed to the clubs and spears of the savage. Men know, when they pass their threshold, that the ties of a life are uncertain, and that desolation may blast. Whatever they leave tranquil and beloved. But there was an intense realization of this hazard in those parts of the colony where protection was least accessible. Death by the hands of a savage is indeed invested with the darkest terrors. It was rarely instantaneous. It was often the effect of protracted torment and of repeated blows. Often, after a long pursuit, in which hope might occasionally gleam for a moment, to render death to the exhausted fugitive more distinct and terrible. Or perhaps, at once wounded mortally and prostrate, when the rush of early affections and long-forgotten truth and brief supplication would come with that swoon, by which nature sometimes ushers in the fatal moment. The dying man would be roused by infernal shouts, and there would swim before him brandished clubs and horrid visages distorted with demoniac rage. Such were the recollections of some who recovered, and such, we may be assured, were the emotions of many that died. Comparatively, the natives did not frequently injure women and children, partly perhaps that they were less exposed, and partly from natural compassion. Thus, when the house of Clark was destroyed by the Big River tribe, and its owner perished in the flames, the woman with him escaped with her clothes ignited, ran to the savages, and fell down upon her knees, imploring their pity. One of their number extinguished the flames and bade her be gone. It may be doubted if this instance of compassion always found a parallel in the conduct of the white. About the same time, a wretch boasted to Mr. O'Connor that he had thrown a native woman on the fire and burnt her to death. The equity of Providence seems vindicated by the fact that he perished by the spears of the race, who watched him continually until he fell into their power. Long after the Pacific mission of Robinson, it was found necessary to restrain the wanderings of the women, to prevent their sacrifice to white vengeance. But, on the part of the natives, there were not wanting fearful examples of implacable and treacherous violence. Such was the murder of Mrs. Goff and her children. In 1828, about 20 men, unattended by their families, had reappeared in the centre of the island and approached the neighbourhood of Oatlands. They attacked the cottage of one Moore as a feint, and thus drew off the husband of the unfortunate woman to the assistance of his neighbour. On returning, he met his daughter with the sad intelligence that children and wife were murdered, and that she only had escaped. He found the mother leaning against a fence, covered with blood. "Dear Goff," she said, "it is all over with me. The blacks have killed me." He endeavoured to staunch her wounds, then hastened to his children, and found them, not dead, but dying. The blacks had inflicted reiterated blows and answered entreaties with threats of murder. Mrs. Goff was shortly afterwards laid beside her children. The attack was more fierce and yet deliberate than common, but not long before, some stockmen at the lakes requested 2 women to ascend the trees. While there, they shot them. It is necessary to add that the women sometimes approached the huts as spies, or such actions would be incredible. The government and the press complained repeatedly that no regular resistance was offered to the depredators, that the settlers did not instantly pursue and, by combined efforts, intimidate or destroy them. It was said that they easily forgot the danger so soon as the blacks had withdrawn and abated even the ordinary vigilance which such formidable enemies might inspire. Thus, the slaughter of a shepherd had become too frequent to produce much sensation and was set down as a common risk of colonial life. When they heard that a servant was speared, they would exclaim, "Ah, is he killed? Poor fellow!" And having brought in a verdict of willful murder, they left him to the forgetfulness of the grave. It was said that as the passenger approached the towns, he found the anxiety of the people diminished and their feeling revolutionized. In the interior, the blacks were spoken of with intense fear and detestation. In the capital, even their depredations were questioned, and the subjects of conversation were rather their sufferings than their crimes. Governor Arthur strongly censured the negligence of farmers, but this was rather to arouse them than to decide finally the fact or culpability of their inaction. In truth, the pursuit of a party of Aborigines was a very hopeless affair. It required a minute preparation, and to a well-fleshed and not perhaps youthful yeoman was attended with vast fatigue and almost certain failure. An organized enemy may be found not so naked and scattered blacks, undistinguishable from the trees of the wood, who could crouch in a gully, creep almost as rapidly as a dog. The appearance of apathy in reality resulted from the uselessness or danger of action. Nor can it be a matter of surprise that men expelled from their minds an evil merely possible, which they hoped to escape, and which no forethought would avoid. Whether these imputations were just or not, they were revived in various forms by the governor's private and public addresses. They constitute a large portion of his correspondence with the home government. But they drew forth from the Secretary of State what perhaps was chiefly desired, an approbation of his measures of protection, for however apathetic individuals, it was admitted that the repression of outrage, from whatever cause and at whatever cost, was an obligation on government. There were, nevertheless, several instances of courageous defense. Large numbers were successfully resisted by a single musket, and it was stated by Governor Arthur that 2 armed men would strike a whole mob with panic, a contempt of their valor which was often provoked by the subtlety of their escape. Such is commonly the case. Savages, even when courageous, are unwilling to face the deadly weapon of the white man. They, however, lost much of their alarm, and at length would pause for the report and rush on with shouts of defiance when the English had discharged their guns. The most courageous instances of defense were furnished by females. They were sometimes surprised by a visit, when escape was hopeless and relief unattainable. Mrs. Maclenachan maintained a post, purely by her resolution. Mrs. Dalrymple Brigg, a half-caste woman, was rewarded with 20 acres of land for her heroism. She drew inside her house her wounded child, barricaded her door, and fired through a crevice. The blacks attempted, first to pull down her cottage, and then to destroy it by fire. The conflict lasted more than an hour when relief came. Another, Mrs. Connell, defended her house with the musket, a little child of 4 years bringing one to her as she fired off another. She was within a few days of her confinement. The fortitude displayed on these occasions was very justly admired. We cannot, however, but be sensible that few possessed either the physical strength or the knowledge of arms equal to a task so hard. In this colony, 1830 will be ever memorable as the year of the Black War, that campaign which formed the first military lesson given to the colonists. In the ferment of the public mind, innumerable plans were propounded for their capture. Some merit remembrance from their oddity, and some for their kindness. It was suggested that those natives in custody should be driven forward, secured by a tether, and thus compelled to guide the pursuit. It was also proposed that depots of flour, sugar, and other tempting articles of food should be placed in the tracks, and when natives were engaged in seizing the prize, the Philistines would be upon them. A third plan recommended that 4 or 5 persons should be placed in the vicinity of huts, to be erected for the purpose. They were to stand outside and allure the natives, and when seen by them, to feign alarm and run. The natives, it was expected, would make for the seemingly abandoned dwellings, to be surprised by the English lying in ambush. Their dogs often gave them notice of approach. A scheme was propounded to turn this advantage against them. The English were to be furnished with 2 sets of dogs, one leash, swift and fierce, to pursue the dogs of the natives, but as both would soon vanish from the sight of the pursuers, the second species were to be retained to scent their course. Thus, the native would run first, his dogs after him, then would come the large dogs of the English, then their little dogs, and finally the captors. An old mariner who had witnessed the effect of music in taming savage tribes proposed to try the persuasion of sweet sounds. He was not aware that the expedient had been in vain tested under happier auspices. Even had it been possible for a military band to career along with the requisite speed, the musician of the Recherche carried his instrument on shore and played his sweetest melodies. The natives took no notice. Unwilling to doubt the efficacy of his art, on his next visit he used sharper tones and quicker measures. The Aborigines put their fingers to their ears, and the Frenchman dropped his fiddle in despair. It will be proper briefly to notice the state of the public mind at the moment. The natives were now a mere handful. An irregular contest of several years' duration, now and then slackened, was ever adding some new victim to the slain. The constables occasionally fell in with the temporary huts, which told the mournful tale of rapid depopulation. In tracts where 30 or 40 huts had, in former years, indicated a considerable clan, 4 or 5 only were reared. But while the natives diminished, they seemed to increase their activity, moving to various places with almost incredible swiftness. It is said that they would travel 50 miles in a day. Their superior knowledge of the country enabled them to reach stations more remote in appearance than reality. A colonist of the present time, by better acquaintance with the road, can pass in a few hours to places once several days' journey distant. Such rapid progress may perhaps be doubted, but it was sufficient to give them the appearance of ubiquity. And since they now were no longer casual but habitual robbers, the havoc and alarm they created had rather augmented as their numbers declined. The colony, then prosperous in its general affairs, was deeply depressed by their continued outrages. Shepherds would no longer tend their flocks unless accompanied by armed companions. On the slightest signal of the approaching foe, they would flee with precipitation. 10 times a day, the quiet of domestic life would be broken by the fears, feigned or real, of the workmen. If they idled on the road, it was the blacks that retarded them, if they lost provisions, the hut had been robbed by the blacks. Often, too, these vexations were tinged with the ludicrous. The rumour would reach the township that an unfortunate had been speared, who, when more closely examined, was found dead drunk. Some imaginative settler would return with the sure information that the blacks were lurking in the woods. The cautious whites, well armed and skillfully disposed, would march round the hiding place and stealthily approach a stump of more than usual likeness to animated nature. An officer, newly arrived, when the depredations were most alarming and frequent, looked from the window of his cottage in the twilight and discerned many blacks crouching among the stubble of a cornfield lately reaped. He hastened and ordered out his men. They cautiously crept round the enclosure and were gratified as they drew nigh to discover that the enemy had not moved. Another small party of soldiers observed a body of 50 or 60 on the borders of a creek flowing into Oyster Bay. As they were approached by the British, they made for a point of land. It was apparently a certain capture. The soldiers and constables rushed on when the foe took the water. In these adversaries, the colonist will recognize the black stumps left by imperfect farming and the black swans which adorn our waters. Notice was brought that someone in the far interior was killed. The coroner's jury was summoned. The verdict was, of necessity, not yet dead. The disquietude occasioned by an enemy so insignificant, the constant vigilance imposed, and the not infrequent heavy calamities inflicted, are events justly exhibited by the Aborigines Committee as a lesson to mankind. The long oppression of a race, not prone to violence, was now productive of its fruit, and exacted from the colonists a fearful retribution. The most alarming movement of the natives was the systematic destruction of premises by fire. This was revenge within their reach at any hour, and its previous infrequency is a matter of astonishment. In 3 months, the huts of Messrs. Howell, Sherwin and Clark had been destroyed. The property of Mr. Sherwin, lying between hills, was easily watched, and spies were posted on the heights. The mode of firing the premises was deliberate. They kindled the flames at 20 yards apart, so that the whole was simultaneously burned. This done, they went off, shouting and crying out to the English to go away. The extent of the mischief was not so alarming as its forebodings. That element which nature has placed at man's disposal and can be turned by a moment's effort to the destruction of a fortune, might long have proved an effectual scourge and made colonization hopeless. The retention of properties, as well as the security of dependence, required decided and unanimous measures. No part of Governor Arthur's character conciliates greater esteem than his promptitude to encourage humanity in the whites and to win the confidence of the natives. At the commencement of this year, he offered a liberal reward to anyone who should open a pacific communication, or if a convict free pardon. He promised £5 for every adult and £2 for every child taken alive. He entreated the colonists to enjoin the utmost tenderness on their servants, and invariably to spare the women and children. These merciful intentions were but little successful. The rewards were rarely claimed. But no effort in a right direction is ever lost. The conduct of John Benfield, a convict, was distinguished for intrepidity and coolness in a capture, and Colonel Arthur bestowed warm praise. Observing a fire at a short distance, he approached 3 Aborigines, to whom he offered bread. One of them promised to accompany him if he would put aside his gun. This risk he incurred. He led the black to his hut and gave him food and blankets for his companions, and soon succeeded in completely conciliating them all. They joined him in hunting the opossum. Thus he drew them on to the military party stationed at Captain Moriarty's. This man certainly deserved the reward he obtained, and the government notice of an action so courageous and humane must have mitigated the fierce spirit of his class. The orders and notices issued by the governor during this year represent the powerful agitation of the public mind, and from which he himself was by no means free. Sometimes the hope of reconciliation seemed strong. Thus, August 19th, he states that Captain Welch and Mr. G.A. Robinson had obtained a friendly parley with a hostile tribe. It was ordered that no attempt should be made to capture or restrain such Aborigines as might approach the settlement, but that, after supplying them with food, they should be suffered to depart. He found it necessary to explain the conditions on which rewards were offered for capture, which had been abused by the violent detention of inoffensive natives. Those who, in attempting to arrest them, were guilty of wanton mischief were threatened with the penalties of the law. These orders were followed by outrages, which threw doubt on the propriety of distinctions. The ally of today was the robber of yesterday and the assassin of the morrow. The natives of the southwest districts of the colony and of the islands were still exempted from proscription, but an explanatory notice authorized the settlers, by whatever necessary means, to anticipate or repel the barbarous attacks, now renewed with terrible frequency and atrocity. These public instructions indicate the alternate feelings which prevailed. They were natural to men who, reflecting on the origin of the warfare, felt that measures, now indispensable, were not wholly guiltless. Official list of atrocities committed by the natives. 1830. January 1st. William Smith, in the employ of Triffitt, Jr., killed near the River Ayus. Piper's hut, at Bark Hut Plains, broken open and plundered of a musket, blankets, sugar, etc. Captain Clark's hut, at Bark Hut Plains, robbed, and his house entered by the natives. February 1st, Mr. Brodie's hut near the Clyde was attacked while he was in it. He was speared in several parts of his body, but not mortally. They stole blankets, tea, sugar, etc. February 9th, Mr. Mazzetti's hut robbed, Lawrence Daring, servant to Mr. Bell, killed. February 11th, Mr. Bell's house and servants attacked on Great Jordan Lagoon. The natives kept at bay from the house, but one man received a spear through the thigh. Mr. Hopley murdered about a mile from Mr. Betts. James McCarthy, desperately wounded. February 12th, Mr. Howell's dwelling hut burned, Mrs. Howell and her children narrowly escaping the flames. 20 of Mr. Espy's sheep killed and maimed. Mr. Thompson's hut attacked by 40 or 50. Mr. Patterson's shepherd pursued by the natives. February 17th. John Bluckerby and Philip Norboy killed at Dysart Parish, Oatlands, at noonday. Lawrence Murray, servant to Mr. Bell, killed. A child killed at Baghdad, near the roadside. February 20th. Mr. Murray's house, near Bothwell, plundered of flour, and within a mile of the military station at Bothwell. Mr. Sherwin's house burned to the ground, with the greater part of his property. His servant's hut and fences also consumed. The Weasel Plains hut burned down, a black man wounded in the act of setting fire to it. February 22nd. Captain Clark's barn and corn stacks consumed containing 1,200 bushels of grain. March 2nd. A hut near Captain Clark's fired. A hut at Davis's Marsh plundered. March 9th. A mob of natives appeared at Captain Smith's hut at his run. A part of them killed 100 of his sheep. March 10th. Piper's hut fired and partly destroyed. March 11th. Captain Wood's hut at Poole's Marsh robbed. Mr. Jones's hut, Sideline Marsh, threatened. Mr. Bisdee's hut attacked. Also Mr. Thompson's stock hut and Mr. Brodribb's at the Black Marsh. Mr. Denholm's hut at the same place attacked, and his servant speared. March 13th. McGuinness's hut, Richmond district, plundered of muskets, powder and ball, and everything of value in the house. March 15th. A hut near the mouth of the Carlton River attacked, a man and woman dangerously wounded, 4 spear wounds and a cut on the head, supposed mortal. Another woman speared through the arm. March 19th. About 40 natives attacked the house of Mr. Brodribb, Black Marsh. They were divided into small parties and made their attacks simultaneously. One man speared. On their being driven back, they proceeded to the hut of Mr. Thompson, which they robbed of everything in it. On the same day, a man was speared in bed at E. Dunovan's, Black Marsh. April 1st, John Rayner speared in several places and dreadfully beaten by natives at Spring Bay. May 18th, Mr. Lord's hut at Eastern Marshes attacked. Of 2 men in it, one was dangerously speared and the other dreadfully beaten. The natives then plundered the hut and retired. June 1st, Mr. Sherwin's hut, Weasel Plains, plundered by the natives. June 15th, the Aborigines plundered the Den hut on the Lake River of everything in it and murdered Mary Daniels and her 2 infants in cold blood. August 7th, S. Stockman's hut, Green Pounds, plundered by natives. August 9th, the death of Mr. Sharland, surveyor, and his men robbed of muskets, powder and shot by the natives. On the same day, Government hut, between Bothwell and Blue Hill, robbed by natives, as well as the houses of Mr. Wood and Mr. Pitcairn. A man servant of Mr. Barr's wounded. About 40 natives met by Mr. Howell's party. A woman wounded. August 23rd. The huts of J. Connell and Mr. Robertson attacked, the latter plundered. Mr. Sutherland's shepherds attacked, and their arms taken. One of them speared, arms taken from Mr. Taylor's hut. August 24th, James Hooper killed, and his hut plundered of everything in it. The huts of Lieutenant Bell and Watts attacked by natives, who were repulsed from both. September 8th, Captain Clark's shepherd attacked but escaped. September 13th, 1 man killed and 1 man wounded by the natives on the banks of the Tamar. September 14th, a man employed by government at the lime kilns near Bothwell chased by natives but escaped. September 18th, a private of the 63rd Regiment killed by natives, 2 sawyers speared, one of whom died of his wounds. September 27th, Francis Broken speared and killed. September 28th, 3 men at Major Gray's wounded by natives and 1 dangerously wounded with stones. September 30th, Mr. G. Scott's house attacked by a mob of natives. They speared 1 man and killed another, the body of whom they threw into the river. They ransacked the house of everything they could find and even went upstairs and broke the doors open, a proceeding to which they had never before resorted. They took away blankets, shirts, sheets, knives, 600 or 700 pounds of flour, which they tied up, half a basket of tobacco, 100 pounds of sugar, a bag of tea, and a considerable quantity of slop clothing. So great ingenuity was displayed in the attack that for some time it was supposed that Europeans had conducted it. On the same day, the natives plundered a hut, opposite to Mr. Scott's, of all the tea, sugar, flour and bedding, which were in it. October 16th, the settlement at Sorel attacked by natives, 1 severely wounded, 4 houses plundered of blankets, flour, tea and sugar, and clothes of every description. October 18th, Captain Stuart's shepherd wounded by spears, and Mr. Gildas, a settler, killed by 2 spear wounds. October 19th, natives showed themselves on the farms of Messrs. Gatehouse and Gordon and attacked the house of Mr. Goff, whom they wounded severely. November 16th, 2 huts robbed on the Ouse. November 18th, Captain White's shepherd killed by natives, dreadfully mangled 27 sheep. A hut on the South Esk attacked by natives, everything portable sent off. 1831, February 3rd, the natives attacked Mr. Bursby's house on the Tamar, speared Mr. Wallace in several parts of the body, and inflicted several severe and dangerous wounds on his head. They likewise wounded a child. The hut of All Right attacked by them, plundered of everything it had in it. The hut of Mr. Sutherland, Nork Esk, robbed, 3 horses speared, 3 others wounded. A woman named Mahaskell killed at Retreat, near Westbury. House robbed of £300 of flour, knives and forks, blankets, chest of tea, £100 of sugar, tobacco, 2 casks of butter, 3 muskets and powder. February 7th. Stuart's house attacked by natives who were beaten off. March 8th. 2 sawyers attacked by natives, severely wounded. 2 huts near New Norfolk plundered. March 12th. Mrs. Cunningham's hut at East Arm robbed by natives, she and the child wounded very dangerously. March 21st. Mr. Lawrence's servant murdered and 3 men dangerously wounded by the natives on Norfolk Plains. April 5th. J. Rolton speared through the body whilst at work splitting wood. April 6th. N. Fitzgerald speared twice through the body whilst sitting reading at the door of his cottage. The house plundered by the natives of guns, blankets and other things. April 7th. The same house again attacked. May 10th. Hut on Patrick's Plains, containing government stores, burnt to the ground by natives. Mr. Kemp's establishment at Lake Sorrel attacked by a considerable mob of natives. The firearms carried away, buildings totally consumed by fire, 2 men murdered and 1 wounded. June 6th. Several huts attacked, near Hunter's Hill, J. Triffitt speared. Mr. Baretti's hut robbed, likewise Mrs. Bell's of everything in it, and the wife of N. Long murdered. Mr. Clark's hut plundered. September 5th. Thomas Smith, hut keeper at Tapsley, murdered, hut plundered. John Hinston speared, and hut robbed, 4 sawyers' huts robbed. September 7th. B.B. Thomas Esquire and his overseer, Mr. Parker, murdered near Port Sorrel by a mob of natives, whilst, actuated by the most humane views, they were endeavouring to carry the conciliatory measures of government into effect. Mr. Thomas had received 10 spear wounds and Mr. Parker 11. Stocker's hut desperately attacked. A child wounded, a man named Cubitt speared. September 22nd. Mr. Dawson's hut on Brushy Plains attacked and his servant severely beaten with waddies. September 23rd. Mr. Dawson's servant, Hughes, severely beaten by natives, nearly losing his life. October 3rd. The natives, having possession of firearms, attacked and robbed the premises of Constable Bird and plundered the house of Mr. Amos, Jr. Footnotes: in the western districts, the stockmen were usually mounted. When they saw the natives, these armed murderers galloped after them and delivered their fire without danger to themselves. An estate is called Quambies. The name is a cry of distress and entreaty and signifies "spare me." It was uttered by a black who was found there when imploring compassion. As the supplication is remembered, perhaps not then in vain, but mercy was rarely shown. A volunteer party discovered a tribe in a valley surrounded by steep mountains. From the heights they poured down a volley of musketry and then heaped the slain on the ashes of their fires. Another party overtook a tribe who had displayed a hostile spirit. They were on the banks of a lagoon, and all around were plains. Escape was hopeless. They rushed into the water, As their heads rose above the surface, they were shot. These are specimens which rest on authority not to be disputed. The slaughter of 30 Aborigines in 1838 at a remote station in New Holland instanced the cool deliberation with which they were too often sacrificed. The deed was planned several days before, and the leisure of the Sabbath was employed for its perpetration. The 7 murderers had been all prisoners of the Crown. A subscription was made for their defence, but in spite of strong sympathy in their behalf, they were sentenced to death and ultimately executed. There had been no provocation. Being on horseback, they surrounded the natives, who were reposing beside their evening fires. These ran to the hut of one of the assassins, with whom they had lived on terms of amity. There they were bound, and amidst their groans, cries, and tears, men and women with children at the breast, they were led off to a spot selected for the immolation. Great pains were taken to conceal the crime, but through a fall of rain the day preceding, their tracks were visible, and birds of prey attracted attention to the slaughter. The strongest suspicion existed that the murderers were the miserable agents of persons still more guilty. The Aborigines Committee observed that an opinion was gaining ground in the colony that small parties should be formed by the settlers for the extirpation of the blacks, an idea which they contemplated with horror. It was more than an opinion, it was a terrible reality. End of chapter 46, being the Aborigines. Section 5.